of probable frontotemporal dementia. Welcome to Dementia Advocacy Canada's webinar, The Value of Rehabilitation for People Living with Dementia. This is going to be an exciting one today. It's something that I've been personally looking forward to for months, about rehabilitation. And we have two incredibly gifted speakers and people with great knowledge. The first one is our own Christine Thelker. Christine is a dementia advocacy member from Vernon, BC, and she's also a current board member of Dementia Alliance International. And I must say she's a busy board member for the DAI. She was diagnosed with vascular dementia 3 years ago at the age of 56. Christine's advocacy work has seen her speak at the Alzheimer's Disease International Conference in 2019 at the 12th session of the Conference of State Parties, also known as COSP, to the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities at the United Nations 2018, as well as a side event at the Ford Center in New York. Christine writes a regular blog called Chrissy's Journal, which is on Facebook, and she is currently publishing her first book. She previously worked for the Interior Health Authority for 13 years in various sites, including in dementia care, end-of-life care. She advocates for families and patients and for better training for workers in dementia care. She also advocates for better working environments for the employee. Our next speaker that we'll be having today is Dr. Kathy McGilton. Kathy goes way back, actually, to, for those of you who know ODAG, Ontario Dementia Advisory Group, probably about 2016. She is a person who strongly believes in working with people living with dementia and coming up with solutions together. Get your notes up here, Kathy. And Kathy, I've lost your notes.
Okay, so, I can talk a little bit about my sort of degrees, whatever you'd like me to when I start speaking. How about we do that? Yeah, no problem.
Let's do that. So then away we go. And Christine, I'm going to flip it over to you, as you will be the person who will be starting us off.
Great, thanks. And first off, I better clarify a couple of things, and it's probably on my end because I mix things up regularly now. I was actually diagnosed, yes, at 55, and I'm now 60, so it's a little more than 3 years.
And, a year or two.
yeah, by a year or two for sure. And some of the conferences I spoke at, I've got the years down backwards. So anyways, that's just part of my dementia. So just thought that I'd clarify a little of that up for people. So today, talking about dementia and rehabilitation, it's a really important aspect in dementia for everyone, and for me in particular. I know the things that I do access because I'm fortunate enough to have a doctor that believes in a lot of these different models of rehabilitation, so he helps me access some of them. So I personally know the difference that they make and what the difference they've made in my journey. So that's why I'm a real believer in the whole process of rehabilitation, and why we need to push hard to have everyone have better access to all types of rehabilitation. Okay, so next slide, please. I'll just start reading it here. In early 2017, the World Health Organization launched their Rehabilitation 2030 call to action that's in section 1. The campaign aimed to raise the profile of rehabilitation as a health strategy relevant to the whole community across the continuum of care. The campaign emphasizes that rehabilitation should be offered for all conditions alongside prevention, promotion, treatment, and palliation. This initiative reflects the evolution of rehabilitation from historical models when it was primarily considered a means to support recovery and reintegration following physical injury. Rehabilitation is increasingly accepted as a holistic approach to chronic disease management with goals to optimize independence and prolong engagement. Given this shift, it is surprising that dementia care is seldom mentioned in efforts to promote and expand rehabilitation services. Although the goals of rehabilitation align with the widely accepted ideals of person-centered dementia care, there appears reluctance to use rehabilitation terminology in this context. This commentary identifies the value of embedding rehabilitation in dementia care and considers possible reasons for resistance. Next slide. Rehabilitation usually focuses on a recovery approach with dementia. As there is no recovery, there has been and continues to be little or no rehabilitation offered to people living with dementia. Next slide. Rehabilitation for people living with dementia would be a term would be reablement, and a focus of multidisciplinary rehabilitation would and should be part of the person living with dementia's overall plan to help ensure one stays well and independent for as long as possible, and this should happen at the time of diagnosis. Next slide. So this little slide, oh, something went wrong here. Took a little jump here somehow, but anyways, this little slide, my H has moved into the wrong spot. Just shows the stereotypical view of dementia, that we have memory problems, cognition problems, that there's this steady decline to death. And that's how most people view dementia. And this limits opportunities to increase the ability of the person living with dementia to function at the highest and best capacity possible. Next slide, please. So again, here, this little diagram I did just goes to show if we do a multidisciplinary and some of the symptoms that we, those living with dementia, have, and this is just some, and how they all impact each other. And we have an ability, if we're given proper rehabilitation and it's done in a team effort, to improve our quality of life for a longer period of time. So I just wanted everybody to sort of have a visual about how these things all connect. They're not an individual piece. It all connects for us. Next slide, please. The symptoms reduce the capacity to actively participate in the community and to manage tasks, to continue to maintain independence and manage essentials in daily life. Dementia and its symptoms are multifaceted, therefore requiring rehabilitation in a multifaceted strategy. Research shows there is a synergistic effect that happens with a multifaceted approach to rehabilitation occurs. Next slide, please. And this is what rehabilitation might look like. And this is, again, just some of the things that can be included. Under physical therapy, there can be Pilates, typical physiotherapy, yoga, dance, exercise programs, cognitive therapy, speech, language, technology, nutrition, education, working with the client to help educate them on the right kinds of foods to help their brain, the supplements that they should be taking and watching, tested for to see where they're lacking. Rehabilitation in the workplace is a huge issue. Everybody's jobs are just stopped, and people still have so much to offer. So using the duty to accommodate employers have in place effectively for people with dementia, jobs being adapted to a person's ability, things like adjusting work hours and the ability to move in organizations as your abilities change. And then there's the social settings. People need help to get memory cafes up and running. Those different kinds of programs that create social interaction and that creates better mental health for us. And we very often don't have the help to get those pieces. So then those are all part of rehabilitation. Next slide, please. Changing the perception. Yes, I think we need to work on changing the attitudes from rehabilitation, around rehabilitation, from recovery to interventions and maintaining functions for those living with dementia. Educating doctors, healthcare workers, employers, and the public about what dementia truly encompasses. Education is key at every level, Next slide, please. So in closing, those of the human rights are also legal rights. They reflect the minimum standard of health and social care for people to live with dignity and appropriate disability support. This must include rehabilitation. Some of the most important are the right to equality and freedom from discrimination, the right to life, liberty, and personal security, freedom from torture and degrading treatment, the right to equal universal health care coverage, which includes a full suite of services following a diagnosis of dementia, not only advice to go home and die. And those of us living with dementia are now demanding our right to access to multidisciplinary rehabilitation. Thanks, everyone. Well, that's my little shout out today.
Thank you very much, Christine. That was awesome. And so what we're going to do now is we're going to flip it over to Dr. Kathy McGilton, and she's going to step us through some very realistic things that are going on in Canada that I think a lot of people aren't aware of. And Kathy, my sincere apology. I know you're a professor, I know you're a researcher, and I know you've won awards.
That's good enough. Okay, that's perfect. So I just want to start off by sort of a shout out. Christine, I loved your slides. It sets the pace and some of the background for the work that I'm doing as well. So they're really, we haven't seen each other's slides, but you'll see I have similar messages. I do want to just start off to let you know that I am a scientist at Toronto Rehab. And you'll notice the term Toronto, there's rehab in my title. So I needed to make sure that as a researcher, I was going to be doing some sort of rehab research, and my background is nursing. I'm also a professor of nursing at the Lawrence S. Bloomberg Faculty of Nursing, which is in U of T. But I want to start off with a story. About 15 years ago, I had a very good colleague, friend, who phoned me up, and she said, Kathy, I'm working with some people with dementia in the community, and when they fracture their hips, what happens is we call up these exclusive rehab facilities and say, hey, we need this older adult to come into your setting to be rehabbed. And the number one answer 15 years ago to most of these centers was, sorry, we got no room, we got no access, and, probably most importantly, we don't think you can be rehabbed, bottom line. So I think that I found that quite disturbing because I had done some work as a nurse in nursing homes, and of course we know when people have a diagnosis of dementia, there's varying levels of abilities. It's also walking is procedural, and what does that mean? It means we remember, we want to get up and walk, so it's not like we're learning a new skill. The problem is we need somebody to help us and guide us and help us make sure we can get back to walking. So at that moment, it opened a beautiful area to sort of challenge the status quo of not allowing clients to come into an intensive rehab unit, So what we did is I went back to my physiatrist, who is a doctor that specializes in rehab medicine, and he was really one of the gatekeepers to this unit. And I said, hey, how about we try developing a model of care where we can actually bring clients with dementia onto our unit and get them back home. And I must say, he plus the staff at first were a bit hesitant because they weren't used to this population either. And I have to tell you, we are really, I think, one of the gold standards now in Canada for caring for complex clients with dementia. So I just want to acknowledge the good work that's being done actually at Toronto Rehab. And so I'm going to start at that's the start of my journey. So I'm going to maybe, if we can get the next slide, I'll give you a sense of what's happening. So we're going to talk about situating the issue. What does rehabilitation look like in Canada today for persons with dementia? We're going to talk a little bit about some of the challenges, solutions, and then some key recommendations, which were actually quite similar to Christine's. Okay, next slide. So the problem, I mean, Canadians are living longer. However, not all of us are enjoying good health and well-being as we age. So the population continues to age and our life expectancy increases. The number of Canadians living with multiple chronic diseases and complex health issues also continue to rise. And this is particularly true for persons with a diminished functional and cognitive reserve, ranging anywhere from mild cognitive impairment to advanced dementia. So it just makes the situation more challenging if we have these multiple chronic diseases. Okay, the next slide. So in addition, if and when a person, for instance, with dementia suffers a setback, like a broken hip, and requires acute care hospitalization, the person will most likely experience a significant decline. I just finished writing a chapter, actually, about hospitalization and persons with dementia. So this whole chapter is dedicated to what knowledge do we have about what happens when you actually have a setback, and that could be pneumonia, it could be a hip fracture, and you end up going into a hospital environment. And I'm here to tell you, and I'm sure you know, that the outcomes aren't great. There's considerable setbacks for many people with dementia, and there's also that constant fear if you're the caregiver, you know, can I let my loved one stay in the hospital without me? And there's unfortunately good reason for that. We have limited resources in these environments. We have staff that don't have the knowledge to care for persons with dementia. There's an absence of maintaining independence at a certain point in life. As we get older, people start thinking, well, you're 80. I mean, really, good enough just using a walker. I mean, good for you that you can still walk. Are you kidding? Like, how do we maintain the message that we need to be as independent as possible as long as possible, not just because we're getting older. Dependency is okay. Hospitalized persons with dementia are at greatest risk for this cognitive and functional decline, which is beyond what's expected of the disease. And this is kind of fundamental to the kind of work I do, is that there's more decline than what is expected. So when you go into a hospital and you have dementia, sometimes they think, oh, that decline is just related to your dementia. Well, no, it's often related to perhaps some of our care practices. So if we don't get you up and get you walking, that's our issue. That isn't related to your dementia. That's because we didn't get you up and walking. So we have to always be careful about something called excess disability. So, and what happens with a lot of people, for instance, especially with a hip fracture, because again, this is my main area of research, is that often these clients don't get into rehab and we then label them with this horrific label called ALC, which is alternative level of care. And they end up incurring high cost to the system because they're really living in acute care, waiting for a long-term care bed, and their function further diminishes. Okay, next slide. So far I'm talking about very sad situations out there, and I'm going to hopefully eventually there will be some hope. So because we know there's little rehab happening, some of our persons with dementia do have issues, but really our hope is to help them regain their lost function. So there's a lack of access to some of these facilities currently, and there's really no consistent approach, even in long-term care. So I've also looked at the literature before this presentation and found that in nursing homes, a lot of our clients aren't able to maintain their functional capacity. And since most of up to about 62% of our population in nursing homes have dementia, this is also kind of scary. I have a PhD student who just defended, her name's Charlene Chu, and she actually looked at clients with dementia who entered nursing homes and found that when they first came in, they were actually able to walk for the most part, but within 3 months, she saw a huge decline in their ability to walk. And that's because we're in these environments that one personal support worker has maybe 10 clients. So their job is to get them up and get them going. So it's sometimes much easier to put them in a wheelchair and get them to the dining room. So we found there was quite a loss in just their ability to be mobilized. She actually put an intervention in place, and actually within a couple of months, these clients were doing better than they were doing before they walked into the home. And that was simply by walking with them and getting to know them. Finding out what makes them tick helps too. So you have to have a certain approach. And she had very good outcomes. So the good news story is there are ways to improve this, but overall, we really have very limited any type of rehab in these environments. So next slide. So we now have evidence, though, that the lack of access into rehab is really a nihilistic belief, that a diagnosis of dementia makes a person unable to participate effectively in rehab. I'm actually doing a study, I'm hoping to do a study, and actually I've asked Mary Beth and the Dementia Advocacy Group to kind of help support it, looking at access to rehabilitation in Ontario and eventually probably broader, to see who's making those decisions. Because we need to really understand that and what kind of impact this has for that person in their lives. It's actually quite important. There's also a belief that since there's scarce resources, perhaps the beds shouldn't be available for someone that's cognitively impaired. People talk about things, I think I hear terms like unrehabable, like that's crazy. So we make up terms actually. And we say things like, well, they have to be able to set goals. How many meters will they walk before they leave? It's kind of scary what we can use as reasons for people not to be admitted. It's important to point out here that contrary to the belief, there is evidence, of course, that persons with dementia can be rehabilitated. And so I've actually done some work with my colleagues here at Toronto Rehab, and we've been able to get our clients back home after their hip fracture at the same time as those without. Now, we're looking more at the persons with more mild and moderate impairment, and sometimes with more severe dementia, it is a little trickier, but it's also based on their pre-morbid level of function. Like anything else, if you're out there golfing and you have dementia and you fracture your hip, you're probably going to have a good chance of recovery. But if you are doing a lot of sitting around watching TV and your pre-morbid status is not a little shakier, it might not be quite so easy for you to come back. So a lot of it is not related to your cognition. It's actually your physical. So keep that in mind as we're getting older with our diseases, even with dementia. The more physically active we are, the better off we are if something is to happen to us. Okay, next slide. So as a result, I think we're really noticing, internationally, I'd say more than nationally actually, a real focus on reablement, but also sort of looking at reablement as a new concept. And I'm Christine, you're also talking the same language. I heard you mention this. Yeah. Because people sometimes think rehab is, and it is sometimes, this very high-intensive, multidisciplinary, so it's kind of where I put a lot of my work in. But there's a lot of, think of it as a spectrum, that you sometimes just need reablement, and then maybe sometimes you'll need rehab because you've had that cardiac event or you've had that fractured hip. And so that we have to always be thinking about how do we maintain independence? How do we restore function? And I also am quoting from the World Health Organization that continues to back us to say, rehab has to be the focus moving forward for the future. As we all live older, we have to somehow try to enhance and maintain our function as long as possible. Okay, next slide. So some of the key recommendations are to make rehab and reablement services more available to persons with dementia. So there has to be more of a focus on things like even enhancing and maintaining abilities. And I'm going to tell you about a story that's happening. So what happened about 5 years ago, people in Copenhagen, and they're a little bit ahead of us there, decided, and it was the government, wanted to look at developing policy around reablement and rehabilitation for persons with dementia. So what they did is they actually looked at the literature to see who had published in this area. And I was luckily one of them, so I got invited to go to Copenhagen And a group of about 8 of us sat around a table to kind of come up with principles of reablement to rehabilitation. So it was a real privilege for me to meet other researchers in this area. And we came up with, I think, a pretty nice document on what we should really be focusing on moving forward. And so one of the actual researchers from the Netherlands, what they started to do is, as soon as a person with dementia got into the acute care hospital, it would be flagged within the local region. So when this individual went back to their house, there would automatically be somebody available the next day to help them get walking again and get becoming more independent. Because as I told you, acute care is not a good place for persons with dementia. So we actually need these services available in a timely way, because what ends up happening sometimes is if you come home and you're struggling with walking and getting dressed, people just assume that's your dementia, and you become very impaired before you should be. And that is what the problem is, and that's that access disability I talked about. We also need to convene, I think, federal, provincial, territorial committees to develop standards of programs for rehab care that include a national strategy. So this is like a take-home message from Mary Beth, who's on the esteemed panel trying to decide where our money should go in the national strategy on dementia. We really have to put rehab sort of on the one of the key priorities. And what is that going to look like? We're going to have more facilities available because there is limited access, because there's not a lot of rehab. In November of last year, I was asked to go to Alberta to speak about some of the work we're doing here in Toronto. And in Alberta, they have even even less rehab beds available for people with dementia. So again, Ontario is kind of ahead of the game, but we're still not doing very well. And so it's sort of scary, or I don't know what's happening in the other provinces, but it's hopefully going to be more on their radar. So there definitely needs to be some sort of discussion across the provinces. Okay, next slide. I also agree. There is so little education in the universities, the colleges, where our staff are being trained on how to care for people with dementia. There needs to be a lot more information, practices and standards around this area so that we can actually do a better job of maintaining function, because we all want to be as independent as possible as we get older. Next slide. So I think we need more research. I'm a researcher, so you always have to say this. And because I think we actually haven't figured things out that well. And when I was even just telling you about access to disability, like how to really measure that well, how to know it's not just because it was the disease that they got versus their dementia, how do you tease that out and make sure that people are not falling into that, into access disability. I think we need to really focus on people with chronic conditions, because often the research doesn't look at people that have dementia and a chronic illness, because let's be honest, that's the majority of people moving forward. After the age of 65, I think we each have at least one, and it's up to 3 by the time we're 70. So again, we need to kind of look at this in more detail, and also the caregivers. We need to be very cognizant that they also need to be taught some reablement strategies so that they can try to maintain their loved ones to be as independent as possible going forward. So I guess when we also looked at this wonderful patient engagement process where we asked people living with dementia, this was in the UK, we had a similar process in Canada, and Mary Beth was part of that. It was called the James Linda Lines. But we wanted to identify from people living with dementia what was the most important question that we have to answer going forward. And in the UK specifically, they talked about what's the most effective components of care that keep a person with dementia as independent as they can be at all stages of the disease in all care settings. This is a huge question to answer. Actually, what happened in Toronto, in Canada, when we asked the same question to people with dementia, they actually said stigma was the #1 issue that needed to be solved. And the reason for that, which actually makes a lot of sense, is we can't even get at people thinking about rehab in persons with dementia if we can't battle stigma. So it's similar kind of ideas. Okay, and the next slide. So I think the final message, and this is what I kind of loved about this reablement message, is that the message for policymakers, practitioners, families, and persons with dementia needs to be living well with dementia, but with a focus on maintaining function for as long as possible, regaining this lost function when there's potential to do so, and adapting to lost function that cannot be regained. I mean, we can't kid ourselves. There will come a time that we actually cannot regain that function, but that's a long time away. And so instead of us going to there first, we have to think about how to maintain and how do we regain, and that's where reablement and rehab comes into play. So I think service, delivery, and care for persons with dementia has to be reoriented such that evidence-based reablement approaches are integrated into routine care across all of our sectors. Okay, and the next. That's it. And this is really my email address is down here. And I really, if you have questions for me, you're welcome to try to get in touch with me after. And also I have my phone number. And that's it.
That was great, Kathy. Thank you.
Yes.
There was a lot of great points you made there, and I had a ton of things that I could say, especially because I crossed the line from working dementia care to being the dementia patient. So for me, it's the minute people end up in our care facilities here in BC, all of their remaining abilities are taken away. They're no longer allowed to pour a cup of coffee. They can't, nothing for themselves. And that's where we have to change that whole focus to keep that ability going.
And I just want to mention what I find, especially in long-term care, the regulations are so involved in and it kind of constricts our practice a bit, because when you said that, my first thought was, oh, it's a risk problem. Like if someone's to pour a cup of coffee and they burn themselves, would there be a problem with that? So this is where we have to sort of sit back and go, really? Look at the outcomes. And in the end, the person becomes quite dependent. Is that okay? So there is an element of risk in life, and it's amazing how that sometimes just because of regulation stops us, but in the end, it's not great outcomes for the client.
Yeah. And I know from all my years working, within 6 months of people coming into care, if they walk and dress themselves and do all that, within 6 months they won't be. They'll be in a wheelchair and they will be totally dependent, and because they're not encouraged to walk. Actually, on most of the dementia units I worked on, which is still happening because I still am quite involved with some of them, people are discouraged from moving about because they don't have time to look after them. They don't want them wandering up and down the hall, and it's like, go sit down, go sit down, go sit down. And we need to change how long-term care is managed, and we also need new long-term care for the younger population. We need co-op type housing that allows for people like myself that live alone, that are younger, that could live in an environment where we're co-op housing and helping each other, and we can maintain our abilities, and we can have resources like the rehab coming to us and helping us stay functional.
Thank you very much to both of you. Let's, Lisa, if you can open up the lines here and see if people would like to ask some questions.
Hi, it's Keith from Ottawa. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Thank you for a great presentation. I'm kind of wondering, is there any way that the system has been tracking the success rates of those who were referred for rehab and the outcomes? Like, is there any numbers at all that we can kind of pull up on to show that it is successful?
Yeah. So Keith, you definitely need to email me. That was on that last slide. If you need data. So Dallas Zeitz, so I work with him. He's a geriatric psychiatrist, just moved out to Calgary. He was actually in Kingston. 2016, wrote a wonderful paper around, and actually, because in these large data sets, they're able to track dementia as a diagnosis, which was before very difficult to do. So they now have the algorithm. And he tracked when people had a hip fracture, if they go into these different environments. Number one, long-term care right after their hip fracture. Number two, complex continuing care, which is also usually known as slow stream, which means, by definition, probably a physio, one maybe a week, maybe one time an OT as well. Versus an inpatient rehab, which is more like one physio visit, one OT visit a day, and plus all the nursing care that goes with that to continue that program, versus home. Because if they are going home, there's a pretty good chance they're pretty high functioning as well. Well, the odds were, if you got into the actual inpatient rehab, you lived longer, there's less morbidity. So there's some very good research evidence coming now that if you're given a chance, people with dementia do quite well.
Kathy, I'm just wondering if perhaps you could share that paper with us and then we can circulate it to everybody.
Great idea. I can do that. So some of the work that I'm now continuing to do, because I have to be honest, especially in some environments that do take a lot of clients in with dementia, I did have follow them when they go home. And sometimes there's not a lot of resources when they go home. So I'm tracking that now, and we're doing a big study because we want to make sure that they're getting resources when they go home, because after you leave a very intense rehab program, you've had your OTPT, you go home to be either by yourself or you might have a caregiver, which again, that person might need to help prompt the person, et cetera. So, but you might need a little bit still OT and PT, sort of looking to see what's happening because we want to maintain those wonderful gains that you received while you were in rehab. Thanks, Keith, for that.
Another question? Mary, any questions for you? Lisa, are they able to unmute themselves?
I was able to, for certain.
Were you? Okay.
Hi, I have a question.
There we go.
Yeah. Sorry, it took me a while to get the symbol to pop up. I actually was at Hodgwick in the Dutch Autonomous Village, and I think it's a case where they were taking people to like some of the people to shop with the staff. That's how the house. They actually help to cook meals. So instead of involving people in the current long-term care, moms and dads in a decent nonprofit long-term care, the Grief Center in Ottawa, but even that, they do have physio and they do have the Bike Around project and stuff like that, but they don't make any attempt to truly incorporate rehab. They're helping people to do things, but they're not really embracing the rehab philosophy. Because and I find the more you do, the less you do, the less you're able to do. So I don't know how to change it, but is the long-term care and the Ministry of Health in different provinces looking at good models in other countries?
I wonder if Mary Beth, if you have an insight around that with the National Dementia Strategy. I mean, I've spoken to people within the Ministry of Health in Ontario. I think there's they realize there's a need, but I'm not 100% sure what their actions are going to be. But yeah.
It was funny because as soon as you said the National Dementia Strategy, I whipped out my little book,
Okay.
flying desperately through it. And frankly, I don't remember if there's anything specific to rehabilitation, although rehabilitation, I do believe, was discussed. And because that fits into, as we know, that's our care path. It's part of care. And so you certainly have Jim Mann and myself saying, this is care and this is something we need. Where we are now is to take the things that are in the National Dementia Strategy and make them happen. and so this is really the crux of the matter now, Kathy, and is how do we take this topic and move it forward so that there is a focus on the government to make this happen? Is it, how do we put more money into research? How do we make the money available? How do we prove that this is actually successful for some candidates and will save the system money? How do we work federally, provincially to share resources? So it's this is, I would say, the next step. And certainly if we have Dallas seats in Calgary, Lisa, there's a good story for you right there. He's a good guy to interview. It's the next step. And so I think for me, the question is, how do we take that next step? How do we have people sitting at the board saying, this is what Canadians need and want? And I don't know that answer.
I have a question sort of that follows on what Mary Beth is saying. So Christine or Kathy, do either of you know, has there been any measurement of monies, like with these rehabilitation or reablement interventions, presumably that prevents people from going into institutions or back to the hospital? Like, is there any way to capture those numbers?
So I think the study that I talked about in Denmark, they were trying to capture funds, but it is hard because you're right, it's all prevention, right? At the end, I know for my work, I did work with a health economist, and he was able to sort of suggest that every time a client comes through these acute care, this intense rehab, we are perhaps saving $20,000 a case, because that person's probably not going to be in long-term care for a full year because they got this start. So there are ways to sort of calculate, but it is tricky. But I would agree with you, that's the next place to go, is more of costing, so we can see the benefits. And the same, I go with Mary's situation, long-term care. If you try to keep people engaged, and active, it's so much easier for the staff then too. That's the other part of the burden and the costs we don't keep track of in people's homes as well, because then the person can actually continue to pull up their pants and they can walk. And so you're not the one that's actually getting them in and out of the wheelchair. So I think there's different ways to do costing, Lisa, but to be honest, I don't think that's been a huge focus, but I know that has to be moving forward. Mm-hmm.
Christine, if I can ask you a question. From the background of the CRPD and your work with DAI, I mean, you truly are one of the probably Canadians living with dementia with, the most experience working in conjunction with the CRPD, yourself and Phyllis Fair. And I'm curious on what your thoughts are on how can we ensure that going forward, the National Dementia Strategy implementation is using the CRPD to help make rehabilitation a reality for people living with dementia.
Oh boy, that's loaded.
Yeah. Sorry, I should have sent you a drink beforehand.
Well,
it's a big question.
One of the things that I think is really important in this dementia strategy is we need to go back to some basics, and education is key. I developed a program that I go teach care aid students on a volunteer basis because I was asked to by one of our colleges, because in their whole program, dementia is not even noted. Yeah. And yet they're going to work on dementia units, nothing taught to them. So education, if we can educate people so that when they start working, whether it's in a hospital setting, a long-term care setting, in a rehab facility, they understand the basics and the importance of keeping people's abilities strong. instead of taking them away from them. And education is everything. And that's my number one. I mean, I could give you a whole lot of things, but that's my number one concern, is that we're putting all kinds of people working in environments with people with dementia, and they have no education around dementia.
Gary.
Yeah.
Okay.
So again, I guess my only thought around the policy is, as you're part of that national dementia strategy, I think there's going to be a big push on prevention, Mary Beth, you know, and they're talking about now the concussions, which, you know, I kind of get for the 0 to 30 crowd or whatever. And, you know, we're going to talk a lot about make sure you have your helmet on. And I'm pretty sure they're going to be talking about physical activity. I think this maybe is a place where you start talking about just even preventing decline, where it's not, you know, like that you could almost say to them, but don't forget that people that have dementia, we still need to be thinking about prevention. Yes. So that you could kind of add it into that whole prevention piece, you know, preventing dependence. I mean, that's really what we're trying to aim for. And I think I like the way Christine keeps saying it, ability strong. So you're trying to maintain ability. So people are stronger every day. I think I like that a lot. Mm-hmm.
I'm just wondering, I think Evelyn may have had something to say.
Yes, I did. Okay. My question was one I sent in the other week. It was about rivastigmine, which is something that was prescribed for my husband. And it does not cure dementia, but it is supposed to slow down the deterioration of it, cognitive abilities. Where is the proof? What proof can you see that this is actually working?
So I'm sorry, Evelyn. I actually don't know that medication. So if you want maybe to send me that email, and maybe I can send it to somebody that might have some information on that. I could probably try to help you with that.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. And Evelyn, just as a side note, Dementia Advocacy Canada does not recommend any types of medication. I mean, this is not our field of expertise.
Yes.
So, I mean, we can certainly say from my experience, but it's definitely something we'll shy away from. So if you and Kathy want to hook up, then I hope you find what you're looking for.
Great. Okay. Thanks. Will do.
Okay. Thank you. Mary, did you have another question there?
Yeah, I want to build on Christine's comment. And I think not just PSWs, the doctors and nurses need to be educated too. Because when Dad was in the Montreal Hospital in Ottawa for respiratory issues, I actually had an ICU doctor tell me, your dad's 89. I said 88. Mid-stage dementia. I said early stage. Dr. Dalziel diagnosed him early stage just a couple of months ago with complex health issues. Can argue that one. And you need to decide whether you're going to DNR or resuscitate. And he actually went as far as say, in my opinion, I would recommend a DNR. So he did a dollar analysis on Dad. Yeah. And basically say, oh, this guy, this old geezer, 80 something, almost 90, he has dementia. We should not waste valuable hospital resources on him. And I think that's a issue I've been coming across as Dad was in the ALC bed in the suffered from stroke, is that doctors, medical students, and interns are being taught efficient medicine. Mm-hmm. They're forgetting person-centered care in the equation. Mm-hmm. And I think that we need to stress the education of that in medical school, internship, nursing, etc. As well as PSW, the whole medical profession, because it's unless they understand the person-centered care and to balance the efficient medicine, you can potentially have both. Mm-hmm. But if you're only taught efficient medicine and not being taught person-centered care, then they will only look at you one lens. Just my feedback.
Mary, I wholeheartedly agree with you, and I can tell you in an experience I had a week ago, sitting beside a bedside of a 66-year-old man who has dementia and was should have been made palliative, and who had a very strong, well-defined healthcare directive. And the doctor said, and I'm trying to help his family, and I'm, explaining the whole process of dying to them and, what they can expect, because nobody in the hospital setting is doing it. They're all too busy doing their tasks. So, and this man, his whole healthcare directive is getting tossed out the window. And the doctor stood there and argued with me and said, well, I don't agree with it, and I'm not prepared to honor it. And I just was like, excuse me? And he said, I am no longer willing to talk to you about this. And he turned around and left. And it was like, this is Canada. And we have doctors who are still deciding and using their views and ignoring what the patient is requesting and needing and wanting, and what the family is asking for. And so in this case, it became, and it's not over, there's a whole big thing happening now through all of this. But anyways, and there again comes back to your issue of education. And you're right, it's not just the care workers, it's the whole spectrum is uneducated.
No, it's the focus in a lot of hospital schools is on efficient medicine, and that needs to switch. They're optimizing individual parts and not optimizing the system as a whole. And I'm an engineer. I do planning and forecasting. I build planning and forecasting system for large companies, and I'm going like, I went to a LIM meeting where they're saying, that's the Ontario Health Agency, and they were saying they're trying to minimize the number of days in long-term care. And I go, you gotta be to myself, you gotta be kidding. They want to minimize that, so they push people into ALC beds. It's like, yeah. And there's more option than just long-term care and expensive with a long wait list and private retirement homes. That's very expensive. There needs to be more option in the middle.
Yeah.
I have a question, open question. Is anyone aware of a pan-Canadian organization made up of groups of people who are looking to move rehabilitation forward using the CRPD?
Here in Canada?
Yeah.
Not that I'm aware of.
What was that? Did I hear you say you wanted to start one?
Well, if I had some help, it would be great.
Mary Beth, can you please just explain what the CRPD is?
Yes. So the CRPD is called the Conventions on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And in the year 2016, this tool, which guides countries on how to treat people, basically, and what happened was that the international dementia community said this is the international law on how we should expect to be treated, and there's a number of things called articles, and an article really deals with a particular aspect of living or how to be treating. For instance, Article 25, I think, is to deal with accessibility for health for everyone. And so really, the conventions on the rights of persons with disability, when it started to become a tool on the international basis, which Dementia Alliance International really helped drive, and other organizations started to learn more about CRPD and then to apply it to their own nation. What it means is you can hold people accountable. You can say, in this particular article on the Conventions on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, it is a, it's the law, it's the international law that we need to be able to have this particular access to, for again, rehabilitation is one of them. And so the question then is, we have this international law that we can use as a tool. One is we have to learn more about the law, and this is, Christine will know a ton of this stuff, and I'm sure she has lots of education. This comes from Dementia DAI, so that's Kate Swaffer's group, and they have a lot of education on this. So I would see using this tool like it's been used elsewhere in international mode to hold Canadians responsible for holding government responsible for particular way for how people should live in Canada, and it's a rehabilitation.
And in response to that, Mary Beth, you're absolutely right. And one of the places and that has the power to use it is this organization itself. Because you, for one, have the ability as being part of the, sitting on the working board for the strategy on dementia being rolled out. You can say, this goes against the CRPD's rulings. This goes against, so we need to ensure this is upheld. And so you have the ability to use that tool, which then will ensure that proper funding goes to the right places to help us in the best ways for dementia and the requirements to keep everyone as well as possible. So whether that's the research dollars or where that's all going, you can definitely use that CRPD basis to strengthen your own fight, right?
Well, and you're absolutely right. And this is about, this is a fight all of us have to participate in.
Well, and that's right. And so maybe what we need to do is have more education and more opportunities for at some conferences and stuff to have some people with dementia to speak about the CRPD, for example, and the rights of all of us and what we need. And that's one of the other things that this strategy on dementia has to put forward is we need a voice, whether it's the voice with you, Kathy, as you do your research and planning for rehabilitation services, whatever table it is that there is talk about dementia, we need to be part of it. And we need to say, this isn't working for us because we're not included, and that is against our rights, right? And so it's a really strong tool to use to help propel things forward on a lot of different levels.
And you're absolutely right. And you'll be happy to know that one of the 5 principles that we fought very, very hard for was the principle of human rights.
Yeah.
So the foundation is there for people to, I really think, come together. How do we come together across Canada? Are these different organizations? Kathy, your science rehabilitation. Christine, the advocacy piece of this. The Dallas seats. How do these different groups come together, unite, and say, this is what we need?
Well, what we need is a conference where we bring people from all these different pieces together, and out of that have a working group that is going to work hand in hand with how all of this stuff is rolled out. And that's what has to happen. They have to put some of those dollars to bring a convention together that isn't just a convention of just researchers or just this. It's a convention that's going to bring key people together to help make a plan so that all these things can be identified, and then the platform is there. Let's go forward. And then it's done across the provinces. Because that's the other problem right now. You've got great stuff happening in Ontario. We've got nothing in BC.
Mm-hmm.
And so, so we need that to start happening. And you're right about that, Mary Beth. We need to bring all that together so we can do it across the board.
So I think in Ontario, we have something called the Rehab Care Alliance, and I know across Canada we have something called the Bone and Joint Network. So I'm trying to work with both of those organizations to try to move this agenda, because you're right, it's at the ministry level that we need to have the voice heard as well,
Yes.
because they're the ones that are ultimately going to say, oh yeah, we're going to have to find some more rehab beds somehow, right? And I love your idea, Christine, to making that maybe, and sometimes I do get into the Ministry of Health, some of their doors, and there's so many different individuals. I have to figure out which is overseeing which portfolio, but that maybe I shouldn't be going in isolation. I should be bringing somebody that actually is living with this experience with me, because the voice is stronger with numbers, and like you said, with different members. So the researcher, the person living with, maybe even some healthcare staff, that are struggling, because, sometimes when we talk to them about, oh, why don't you, what's wrong? Why don't you allow persons with dementia? And they're nervous, or they don't have the education and skills. So we need them to let the ministry hear that, well, this is an issue with our summer education, like that it's broader and bigger. And I don't do that very well. I think that's actually a great strategy. But I wonder if the Rehab Care Alliance is a good place in our province. And I think, because Dallas said he's moving to, now he's in a new province, that there is some information around rehab in your province, in that province as well. We'll be able to start making some comparisons across provinces, because I think you're right. Ontario is one of the best provinces for collecting data in this way. The other provinces don't even have this information. So we're slowly but surely getting that information, so we'll be able to do more work, so we have more evidence for keys, that across provinces, if we have more access, we have better outcomes for this group, and like you said, it save costs. So it's kind of like you said, it's something, and I think you highlight that, Christine, we haven't really been thinking about rehab for the longest time. We'll also tell you what happens at Toronto Rehab is nobody gives money. Like, when the foundations are all out, by the way, we were competing against Sick Kids across the street and Princess Margaret, which is down the street. And people give to those causes all the time. And what's fascinating is everyone in their lifetime will need to be in a rehab bed probably, or need some sort of rehab services. So I think people are just starting to realize that, because in the past we died, but now we don't, you come back from the cardiac surgery and now you need cardiac rehab. And the same goes with your new, you used to just have so much pain, but now we have a new knee for you, a new hip. So rehab's here to stay, and I think people are starting to realize this more and more. We just have to make sure that it's available to all, and that's the problem right now.
And I think part of that problem is, again, the education, because we still have this misconception, and that's why people are so not willing to give their money quite so easily, because, well, there's nothing they can do for them anyway, so why are we going to give them $20? I'll go over here and give it to this cancer person because they'll get better, the dementia person won't. They don't understand that we can still live well and pretty full, productive lives.
Yeah.
So we have to change that.
Yeah, and I was actually saying that more in general, like Toronto Rehab serves everyone, but people still don't quite understand how that's going to, it's not yet out there. World Health Organization got it. Whoever wrote that document, wow, they had insight. But I'd say the majority of the Canadians don't even realize this is an issue. Not only rehab for persons with dementia, I'm talking for anyone. And there's very few programs in Canada focusing on rehab. So the science behind that is growing. It's and how to service individuals of all types. It's sort of growing, and now it's like I said. Now we have to start looking at the more vulnerable populations that have been excluded a bit and trying to make access. So a couple layers, but we need to do it.
Kathy, you just mentioned World Health Organization document that did it really well. Which document is that you're referring to?
So it's the same one Christine referred to, I'm pretty sure. Actually, there was a couple of reports. One of them is just on rehab, but I think I was talking about just the World Health Organization generally, that they're talked about. The number one goal is to maintain independence as we get older. And it's almost impossible to do that without some sort of rehab, restorative care, given that we're going to have, unfortunately, some accidents in our lives and or a chronic illness creep up on us. And we have to do something. Mm-hmm.
Other thoughts? So have we just solved world hunger?
No.
Mary Beth, it's Kate here.
Hello, Kate.
How are you all? It's been a really interesting webinar. Thanks for putting it on. I just wanted to, I don't want to be a wet blanket, but Christine was there. It may give us an indication of how big a battle we're going to have rehab included. See, there's been very good evidence for rehab for dementia for at least 15 years. And like Kathy, I'm currently writing a book chapter on it. But, Christine and I were at the Convention of State Parties or Conference of State Parties this year, and we had to have a protest rally for wheelchair access to the main conference room. So if we're doing that at the UN for wheelchair users, I think we've got a long way to go for rehab and dementia. Just thought I'd add that in.
Yeah.
I'm glad you brought that up, Kate. I was going to hit a touch on that, and then I got off track and forgot. But
I think that something that's happening in Australia, we've got a Royal Commission into aged and dementia care, and it's highlighted horrifically the serious systemic neglect and abuse of people with dementia and people living in institutional care. We have there's a legal firm currently putting a class action case together against an aged care provider. And I actually think that we need a couple of patients who've been diagnosed with dementia and denied access to live, including rehab, to actually take legal action. I think it's going to take legal action to actually educate the world that this is not just a human right, it's a legal right. It's a big job.
Yeah, it is a huge job, and I can sort of add to that from a perspective here. This gentleman that I was just helping, who just passed away, he went into care, and within the week before he went into care, we were downtown having lunch out. He's very active, and even months into care, he would go out for the weekend with his family and go boating and beach combing and all kinds of stuff. But being in care and receiving no services in his care facility, within 8 months he was dead. So there, no attempt from anybody except those of us outside of the facility who were trying to get him out of there to keep him as active as we could. Was there any help in rehabilitation services for him? And his family is now going, what happened? Like, why wasn't anybody doing anything to help us and help him, right? Why did they just keep putting him to bed and putting him to bed and putting him to bed. And that's a real systemic problem. The system is broken.
That's a good word for it. Kate, can I circle back to you? I'm just curious if you are aware of an international framework of some sort or an organization that people are starting to join forces over this, looking at best practices.
Well, the WHO Rehabilitation 2030 group, I went to the meeting 2.5 years ago, and I went to the meeting in July this year. And they have a call to action, and they have produced a document again this year that's rehabilitation for all. It's been actually quite hard to get the dementia voice in there. But so Dementia Alliance International is one of the founding members of the new Global Rehabilitation Alliance organisation. Was 14 organisations, and that came out of the first Rehab 2030 meeting in February 2 years ago. So that's it's a pretty new alliance of organisations, and new organisations can become members. There's a fee to become a member. So your organisation, Kathy, that you mentioned, the Rehab Care Alliance, you could join the Global Rehabilitation Alliance, and I'd strongly recommend you do, to have a voice. Dementia Advocacy Canada could join as a national organisation. There'd be a fee for you, same as there's a fee for DAI, but there hasn't, because it's only in its, we celebrated our first birthday in May at the World Health Assembly. So it's really only in baby steps as an alliance, but it is getting stronger, and it's working inside the WHO, not outside of it, because it was inspired kind of through the first Rehab 2030 meeting. So it's worth, joining if you can find the funds for DAC to join it. I'd seriously consider. I'm happy to connect Kathy, you, and also Mary Beth.
That'd be
I would
great.
really like that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So,
And
there's a lot of representatives, so it's good to have Dementia as an organisation, a global organisation in that alliance. Everyone was quite shocked that we were there. Okay, well, we want rehabilitation as well.
Well, it's actually, Kate, I know that there was a competition where you had to send in base case scenarios. So we actually sent in our story at Toronto Rehab, how we were rehabbing this client group. We were looking at the health economic costs, and it was shortlisted to get into that. And all of a sudden, the next thing I know, it doesn't make it to the final, end mark. And so it's funny you said that. It's squeezed out somehow. Like, people were thinking, wow, this is a really great case, and you're trying to spread the model.
Well, I mean, dementia is too often in the global meeting space, I'll call it that. So I attended fortnightly meetings for 2 years representing people with dementia for the high-level meeting in New York in September last year. Alzheimer's Disease International had a representative attending those meetings fortnightly for 2 years. And the WHO and NCD Alliance, and we are supposed to be represented, there was not one mention of dementia at the high-level meeting in New York last September. I'm not talking about this year, I'm talking about last year. And again, not this year, even though we've been meeting fortnightly trying to get the voice of dementia into the conversation at the UN. So it's a hard space we're in. When you've got healthcare professionals who don't have education in dementia generally, how are we ever going to expect them to think that we have a right to rehab? So, the recent World Alzheimer's report from ADI, and they surveyed over 70,000 people, 62% of healthcare professionals still believe dementia is a normal part of aging.
Wow.
So, we've got it's a hard road that we're in. And I honestly think if I went to, so I did a presentation at my first ever ADI conference in London in 2012, and it was about all of the non-pharmacological interventions, including rehab. And I was practically, I'm not joking, I was nearly laughed off the stage for my presentation. And the following year, a Chinese professor from Hong Kong gave a presentation at the ADI conference in Taiwan about non-pharmacological interventions for dementia, and it was almost my presentation from the year before. But, you know, 95% of the people in the room, it was a parallel session, practically laughed me out of the room. But one, interestingly, she was from Canada, one neurologist came up to me at the conference dinner in London, and she came up to me, and it was kind of advocates, it's a hard road being an advocate or an activist, and you do need these occasionally. And she came up to me at the dinner and thanked me for the presentation. And she said, look, I have two patient cohorts, half of patients who've had stroke, half of patients with dementia. I offer all of my stroke patients rehab. I offer none of my dementia patients rehab, and I can now, thanks to your presentation, see that I should be offering them rehab. So, you know, that was one person who was positively impacted by a speech and a response to the speech that almost made me give up. Like, it's tough when you get, you know, the chair was so rude as I walked off the stage. And, you know, I look at that presentation now online, and you know, it was one of my first conference presentations, and it was pretty basic and a pathetically unprofessional looking presentation in contrast to what I'm presenting, or the way I would present now. But still, the message was exactly the same. And then the message next year, 1 year later, and of course, people in Asia, I have a much better response from people in the Asian countries because they're used to Eastern medicine. They all use health and rehab and herbs and supplements and, you know, Reiki and acupuncture. You know, they've had thousands of years of healthcare compared to this arrogant Western medicine that we're facing, and it's the medicalisation of dementia that's the big problem.
Absolutely.
And I have to get ready for a board meeting in 10 minutes, so I do need to go. But I'd love to catch up with you, Kathy, by email, so I'll catch up after. But there hasn't been an opportunity to add any messages in the Q&A or a chat box for anybody. So I had questions along the way, but I forgot what they were now, so there was no opportunity for me to add them anywhere.
That's a good learning point for us, so thanks, Kate.
Yeah, that's okay. It's really, really good day, and I'll see you in 10 minutes again, Christine.
Okay.
Lucky us. Bye.
Bye.
We're in back-to-back meetings today. So I'm glad that Kate jumped in there, because that, you know, back to your, is there any organizations outside of the World Health Organization piece? No. So, you know, maybe that's the place to start.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. We need to look into this. Oh, sorry.
I think we need sorry.
I just want to say Global Rehab Alliance. We're going to have to look into that, Mary Beth.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
It's
And,
all about
then the other
teamwork, right?
piece is a conference, and bring people together so that we can really get a good grasp and have something really strong to go forward with.
Excellent. Well, being that everybody's going to other places.
Yes, we have board meetings and things we have to attend to.
I have one other thought. Not that I'm going to probably put this conference together for you, but we have to also remember hearing, vision rehab. There's a bunch of work being done now with persons with dementia. There's different types of rehab. I focus on physical. Cognitive was the other issue, and I told Mary Beth that I was not going to focus on that because I don't know it. But when you think about doing a rehab conference, because they're quite exquisite, and even cardiac rehab, I know and very few clients with dementia get in, but there has to be new work done in all these areas. So you could almost see how you'd want to bring together people that do rehab in all these different ways, subspecialties, because rehab with persons with dementia is a specialty. Yes. And so that would be kind of cool to try to start realizing, you know, what are the nuances? And, you know, I'm going to tell you very quickly, doing hearing vision screening assessments with people with dementia are quite a challenge if they have moderate to severe, let alone the interventions that are required then, you know, especially if you've not worn a hearing aid till after you had the dementia. So there's a lot that has to be learned, and this is going to only continue. And I think I was at a conference and they said 50%, like the world prevalence is just increasing. So I don't understand how WHO doesn't think that dementia has to be one of their major populations focused on going forward. But anyway, so I don't know, Mary Beth, I don't want to offer too much, but I think the notion of bringing people together, that are rehab specialists in all these different streams could be brilliant for Canada.
And that's my thought. I think that that's an area that we need to work on, and I'm happy to help with that. We need to try to figure out where we can get the funding to make that happen. It's a really important for Canada going forward, I think.
I just want to share with you one of the organizations called Speech, Language and Audiology Canada, called SAC, provided a submission to Public Health Agency of Canada to inform the National Dementia Strategy. And that was in 2018. So, you know, that would seem like a great organization to reach out to. They understand the dynamics of the Stratford dementia world. And boy, I love it when stuff like this happens. So great job, everybody. Let's make it happen. Let's do it. Okay. So in particular, thank you to Christine. You're amazing. It's really great to hear you speak. Kathy, to you as well.
Thank you.
To everyone else who has joined today.
Hope to see you again.
Okay.
Really
On that note, have a great day, and we'll see you at our next webinar.
Thanks.
Sounds great.
Bye.
Okay.